The ocean is honest when it wants to be cruel. Storms announce themselves with wind and waves. Shipwrecks leave debris. Disasters leave scars. But sometimes the sea does something far more disturbing. Sometimes it leaves everything intact and removes the people. In April 2007, a 12-meter catamaran named Kaz II departed from Airlie Beach, Queensland. It was not a historic journey, not a race, not an expedition. It was a delivery trip. The yacht was being sailed south along the Australian coast toward Perth. On board were 3 experienced men, sailors who knew the sea, understood its risks, and had crossed far more dangerous waters before. The weather forecast was favorable. The vessel was in good condition. The route was well traveled. There was nothing remarkable about the departure. And that is precisely why the ending would be unforgettable. For several days, no one worried when radio contact was minimal. Offshore sailing often meant long stretches of silence. The crew was expected to check in later, but the check-in never came. Eventually, a search was initiated, not out of panic, but routine concern. Then, a passing aircraft spotted something unusual. A yacht was drifting aimlessly off the northern coast of Australia. Its sails were still raised. What made the scene unbearable was not what was missing, but what remained. The air inside the cabin was stale, warm, and undisturbed, as if it had been sealed moments ago. Nothing suggested abandonment. Nothing suggested urgency. The clocks were still running. The instruments hummed quietly. The yacht behaved as though it expected its crew to return at any second. The table was set with an unsettling carelessness, not packed away, not knocked over, just paused. A half-finished meal is not evidence of disaster. It is evidence of interruption. Experienced sailors do not leave food uncovered at sea unless they intend to come back almost immediately. They do not step away from a meal unless something demands attention, something outside the routine, something urgent but not terrifying. Whatever drew the men from the cabin did not feel like danger. It felt temporary. That detail troubled investigators more than any missing equipment. Because storms create chaos, accidents create damage, violence leaves traces, interruption leaves nothing. The Kaz II did not look abandoned. It looked distracted, as if the crew had stepped away to deal with a minor problem. Something that should have taken minutes. Something they had solved dozens of times before. But minutes turned into hours, and hours turned into absence. When authorities reached the vessel, they were not prepared for what they found. There was no damage, no collision marks, no signs of a storm. The engines were operational. The navigation systems were powered on. The fuel tanks were not empty. Everything necessary to continue the voyage was still there, except the crew. Inside the cabin, the scene felt disturbingly normal. Plates sat on the table. Food had been laid out. A meal had been started, but never finished. Lunch was still on the table, not spoiled, not scattered, simply abandoned. It looked as if the men had stood up mid-meal and stepped outside, and never returned. Search teams scoured the yacht inch by inch, expecting to find something, anything, that explained why 3 men would leave a seaworthy vessel. They found nothing. There were no overturned chairs, no broken glass, no blood, no signs of a fight. Life jackets were still on board. The emergency beacon had not been activated. The radios were functional. The yacht's dinghy, the small inflatable boat used for short trips, was missing. But that alone explained nothing. A dinghy could be used briefly and returned. It was not a lifeboat meant for abandonment. Nothing suggested the men planned to leave permanently, and nothing suggested they were forced. Investigators attempted to reconstruct the final moments. The raised sails suggested the yacht was under control shortly before abandonment. The engines working suggested no catastrophic failure. The food being prepared suggested calm, not urgency. This was not a ship fleeing danger, this was a ship interrupted. Something had drawn all three men away from the cabin at the same time. Something important enough to abandon lunch. Something urgent enough to leave without safety gear. Something that never allowed them to return. The most common explanation was simple and terrifyingly plausible. Man overboard. One sailor falls into the sea. The others rush to help. In the chaos, all three are lost. It happens more often than people realize, but this theory raised questions. Why was no emergency signal sent? Why was the yacht not stopped or turned sharply? Why was the dinghy missing, but the yacht left unattended? Another theory involved a rogue wave, a sudden, powerful swell capable of sweeping people overboard without warning. But the weather conditions reported were calm, and rogue waves typically leave damage. The Kaz II showed none. Each explanation fit part of the story. None fit all of it. Experienced sailors do not abandon a vessel lightly. They do not leave without life jackets. They do not fail to trigger emergency systems unless there is no time. And yet, there was time to prepare lunch. There was time to adjust sails. There was time for routine life to continue, until there wasn't. What unsettled investigators most was not the disappearance itself. People are lost at sea every year. What disturbed them was the timing. The moment between normal life and absence was preserved perfectly. The yacht did not crash. It did not burn. It did not sink. It simply continued, without the people who had been guiding it. The Kaz II became a floating snapshot of interruption. Unlike legendary ghost ships found decades later, the Kaz II was discovered quickly. The sea had no time to erase evidence, and yet there was nothing to examine. No bodies were recovered, no debris surfaced, no final transmission existed. The ocean offered no narrative, only a question mark drifting on the waves. The Kaz II did not become famous because of drama. It became famous because of restraint, because the mystery did not scream. It whispered, because lunch left unfinished feels more unsettling than violence, because it suggested that whatever happened was sudden, shared, and final. Not chaos. Interruption. In an age of GPS, satellites, and constant surveillance, the Kaz II reminded the world of an uncomfortable truth. Technology reduces risk. It does not eliminate mystery. Even now, ships vanish, people disappear, signals go silent, and sometimes everything works perfectly, except survival. The Kaz II is remembered not as a tragedy of force, but of absence. A reminder that the sea does not always destroy. Sometimes it pauses life mid-sentence. Sometimes it leaves the sentence unfinished. Why did three experienced sailors leave a perfectly functional yacht? Why did they leave together? Why did they leave without preparing to survive? No investigation has ever answered these questions. No theory has ever closed the case. In maritime history, wreckage explains disaster, but the Kaz II explained nothing. A meal sat waiting for people who would never return. A ship drifted without purpose, and the ocean remained silent. The sea does not tell stories. It erases them. And sometimes, it leaves behind a vessel, a table set for three, and a moment frozen forever. Lunch still on the table, and no one left to finish it.